Let's start with two excerpts from a concert that the Chrysanthemum Ragtime Band presented in June 1985 at the Valencia Rose Cafe in San Francisco, which was our regular venue from 1982 to 1985. You'll see how we played and sang, and you'll get an idea of how we were received. Here's a rag from the first set, Scott Joplin and Scott Hayden's Sunflower Slow Drag.
Anyway, the ultimate or possibly penultimate piece of the set is going to be a collaborative job in which Scott Joplin was involved, but also one of the many young men that he took as his proteges, both in Missouri and New York. This is one named Scott Hayden, and the piece is called The Sunflower Slow Drag. And we're playing this, of course, June is also the month of Gay Freedom Day, and people often think that slow drag means a transvestite and a Quaaludes. In fact, it doesn't. It's the name of the dance, but it's a very good, it's a very good description of the pace of the Gay Freedom Day parade. So we're dedicating this to all of our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters who will be marching on June 30th. Sunflower Slow Drag. 1901.
Thank you.
how we played. Here's how we sounded when we sang. Were great for gay people in California, especially San Francisco. Homosexuality was stricken from the American Psychiatric Association's list of mental diseases in 1973. I felt much better after that. In 1974, Kathy Kozachenko was elected to the Ann Arbor City Council, becoming the first openly lesbian elected official in the US. And the California legislature passed a law decriminalizing homosexual sex in 1975. Harvey Milk became a San Francisco supervisor in 1977 and successfully sponsored a non-discrimination bill for the city and county. The Castro district began to bloom with new bars, restaurants, and stores aimed at gay clientele, and San Francisco's big Halloween celebration moved from seedy Polk Street to glittering Castro. The Gay Freedom Parade got bigger each year and attracted big mixed audiences. Straight people relaxed a little, some straight people. Others tensed up. Among them, John Briggs, a right-wing Orange County crusader who got an initiative called Proposition 6 onto the 1978 ballot that would have made it easy for schools to fire teachers just because they were homosexual. The Briggs Initiative had already gathered enough signatures to appear on the ballot when the 1978 Gay Rights or Gay Freedom Day Parade spilled down Market Street on June 25th, with a feature that was absent from the previous 6 parades: a marching band. John Sims, on the upper right of this picture, a music teacher who had recently moved to San Francisco from Kansas, felt that part of the answer to anti-gay bigots like Anita Bryant, Jerry Falwell, Briggs, and millions of others was to show a side of gay life different from the lurid and false picture that they were peddling. So he recruited musicians and conducted a few rehearsals, and the Gay Freedom Day marching band and twirling corps sprang into being. I didn't go to the 1978 parade, but a week or so later, on the beach at Lake Temescal, I met a trumpet player from the new band who urged me to join, so I went to the next rehearsal. Everybody seemed to be having a good time. I was looking for a good time, and I felt that in a small way, I would be doing what Harvey Milk advocated. Quote, I would like to see every gay doctor come out, every gay lawyer, every gay architect come out, stand up, and let the world know. That would do more to end prejudice overnight than anybody would imagine. Meanwhile, John Sims was preparing for the campaign against Prop 6. The Gay Freedom Day Band was too large to play at indoor fundraisers, so Sims brainstormed with a group that included Philip Grudy, Larry DeLaurier, Alan Young, and possibly others to create smaller groups, such as a Dixieland combo, a German band, and a ragtime ensemble. As all of you know, ragtime was enjoying a robust revival in the 1970s, with Vera Brodsky Lawrence's collections of Joplin rags and songs, Jeremy Rifkin's and William Balcom's LPs, the Oscar-winning score for The Sting, the New England Conservatory Ragtime Ensemble's recordings, and Gunther Schuller's editions of Joplin orchestrations. Philip, and probably Larry, had played in a ragtime orchestra led by Alan Young around the time of the sting, so they already had access to some charts, including Schuller's, and Sims had lifted a few arrangements from his fraternity house before he fled Kansas. From these seeds grew the Chrysanthemums. The ensemble didn't model itself after Schuller's group, however, which recorded only rags. From the outset, we played a variety of music from the period 1890 to 1920. Rags, of course, but also intermezzos, marches, waltzes, polkas, popular songs, both raggy and square, and a few times, even Fonsupe's Poet and Peasant Overture. That was a riot. We were closer in concept to Albert White's Gaslight Orchestra from San Francisco in the 1950s than to Schuller's ensemble, although we were far less skilled than either one. Musicians were recruited from the Gay Freedom Day Marching Band and the wide network of musicians radiating from Sims, Philip, Larry, and Alan. Because I had a background in playing jazz and was interested in learning more about ragtime, I volunteered to fill the cornet chair. Philip played cello, Larry played flute and piccolo, and I think Sims played piano at the very first rehearsals in August 1978. Our first public performance was in the Castro Theater at a fundraiser called A Little Rights Music on September 22nd, 1978, with San Francisco Mayor George Moscone among the featured speakers. That evening we had 13 musicians, piano, 7 strings, and 5 winds. We went on to play a handful of other fundraisers. Thanks to Harvey Milk's tireless and witty campaigning, a huge grassroots effort to ease the fears and raise the consciousness of California voters, and the usual public indifference to non-presidential elections, Proposition 6 was smashed, with about 60% voting no. Even Ronald Reagan, then gearing up for a presidential run, had publicly opposed it. Although it was no longer needed for fundraisers after the election, the Ragtime Ensemble decided to stick together. At some point between the defeat of Prop 6 and our first paid gig in January 1979, and after much debate, we came up with the name taken from Joplin's The Chrysanthemum, an Afro-American intermezzo, which we played pretty nicely. Larry spent a lot of time looking for, and energy, looking for performance opportunities, and his gay networking led him to Hokum W. Jeeves, a hilarious comedian seen here playing an automobile muffler and a toy piano, who was also booking acts for the cabaret at the Hotel Utah. We debuted at the Utah on February 3rd, 1979, and performed there monthly until early 1982. The Hotel Utah had a pretty compact performance space, about twice as big as the low-rise stage that you see in this photo. The most exciting aspect of the Utah for me was the view from the stage. Besides the folding chairs on the ground floor, there was seating in a gallery halfway up the tall room, and most of the time, both levels were packed with gay people and their straight friends, most of them stoned, and all of them ready for the silly fun provided on stage. It was a kind of wall of spectators, much more intense than the usual horizontal array. During the Utah run, I began to act as the master of ceremonies to provide a little context for our archaic and unfamiliar repertoire, and to kid around about the music, the events and personalities of 1890-1920, and the contrast between gay life then and now. Most of the music was campy anyhow, and we goosed that aspect of it a little by featuring pieces like Pansy Blossom Rag, Fairy Moon, Whoa Nelly, and Sunflower Slow Drag. We didn't add any comic touches to the music itself, however, but played it as authentically as we could and hoped that its charm would come through. We performed to mostly gay audiences, both in person and on the radio, in other venues during the Utah days, but we also moved into the straight market by playing at the annual showcases of the New Orleans Jazz Club of Northern California, the NOJC, in February of 1980 and February of 1981. These unpaid gigs introduced us to a wider public and got us the first of many dates at the NOJC's monthly meetings. The first one was November 1981. After Valentine's Day of 1981, the Utah suddenly became unavailable for 6 weeks when Hokum booked Blonde Sin, a drag show starring Doris Fish and the Sluts, for every weekend. After our return to the Utah, gigs there were hard to schedule in advance, so we looked around for a more dependable base. Larry knew Ron Lanza, one of the proprietors of the Valencia Rose Cafe, which had opened that same year. By the fall of 1982, we were regulars at the Rose, continuing until November 1985, the month that the club folded. As at the Utah, the feeling in the room was intense, and we didn't need any amplification for the music or announcements, although we had a mic for the occasional guest vocalist. Larry was energized even more by our slightly upward move to the Rose and ventured to send a tape to Richard Zimmerman, founder of the Maple Leaf Club, who had been helping Larry find orchestrations we could use. Zimmerman forwarded the tape to Stomp Off Records, a specialty label in Pennsylvania that mostly featured bands playing in the styles of the 1920s and 30s, but had 4 ragtime issues in its growing catalog as well. Bob Erdos, the owner of Stomp Off, was very enthusiastic about what he heard and quickly offered to cover the expenses of the recording and production of our first LP, Bringing Them Back Alive, which was issued in 1983. We recorded it at Bay Records in Alameda under the supervision of Mike Cogan, a top-notch recording engineer and producer. Stomp Off marketed the record internationally, and it garnered good reviews. We went on to make 4 more such LPs, issued in 1984, 1985, 1987, and 1988. That first LP was recorded in January of 1983, and in May we got another important break when we came to the attention of David Fowler, a gay former TV newsman and radio station hobbyist who had started to transform a local public radio station, KALW, by adding numerous vintage music shows to its listings. New listeners responded, and KALW became very popular in its limited broadcast territory. One of the shows that David had a hand in was Music in the Air, hosted by an elegant young pianist named Peter Minton, who performed in the cocktail lounge at L'Etoile, a Nob Hill restaurant where he entertained the moneyed crowd with his unmatched repertoire of songs from the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. Peter had heard us in January 1982 at a benefit for the Gay Olympics, as the Gay Games were called until the homophobic International Olympic Committee sued. David persuaded Peter to have us as guests on his show in May of that year, and in July, David persuaded KALW to give us our own show, Come On and Hear. I was reluctant to do the show at first, unsure that we had the time or talent to record enough good music to fill a half hour each week, but the other musicians were eager to try and talked me into it. It ran for almost 3 years on the station, garnering a Broadcast Media Award in 1984 for Best Locally Produced Instructional Show, and a Certificate of Honor from the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. By May of 1984, we were on the air twice a week. Our second and third LPs were made up of tracks recorded for the show by David Fowler in the KALW studio. By the time of the first Stomp Off sessions, Chrysanthemum's instrumentation and personnel had settled down enough that we started making progress with our ensemble sound. For our first gigs, we had 13 pieces with 4 violins and a string bass, But now we have 10, a format we stuck with for the rest of our time together. 2 violins, viola, cello, flute, doubling piccolo, clarinet, cornet, trombone, tuba, and piano. Early on, musicians came and went, but after 1982, there were only a few important changes. The long-term members were Debbie Purcellin on second violin, Mariah Ellis, who had been our first woman member, on viola, Philip Grudy on cello, Bill Tull on clarinet, myself on cornet, Patricia Crossan on trombone, Will Bamer, our house and stage manager, who was also known as the band cowboy because he was from Texas, and Bob Phillips on tuba, who's on the left in this photo, with David LaMarche on piano, who began playing with us in January 1980. He's now the musical director of the American Ballet Theater. He yielded the piano bench to Scott Fogelsong, a young faculty member from the San Francisco Conservatory in 1983. Alan Lorney, who was one of our original violinists, was replaced by Suzanne Wong in 1984. She's here. And Larry Delorier, our flautist, one of our founders and our librarian, left in 1986, succeeded by Robert Gray, who's fourth from left in this photo. Along the way, many others, gay, straight, and ain't nobody's business, subbed on gigs now and then. In all, more than 70 musicians performed with the group. Another important friend and benefactor from the Valencia Rose years was Richard Rutlinger, an ardent gay preservationist whose residence, the 1988 Brune Rutlinger House, is one of the jewels of San Francisco Victoriana. He had co-founded the Automatic Musical Instrument Collectors of America, AMICA, and used his house as a fabulous showcase for his collection of mechanical instruments, from grand pianos to movie house orchestrions, and including even devices that played a saxophone and a violin. He first hired us to give a concert in his sumptuous front parlor in 1983 for an Amica gathering, and there were many more such events over the years. It was always an honor to perform in such a gorgeous setting in front of knowledgeable and responsive crowds. In February 1984, our association with NOJC paid off in an unexpected way when we were offered a continuing slot playing tea dances at Earthquake Magoons, which since 1960 had been the home of Turk Murphy's Jazz Band, a San Francisco institution. We stayed on board until November, shortly before Magoons closed forever in January 1985. In May 1984, we had made our first of 3 appearances at the Super Straight Sacramento Dixieland Jubilee. As the only ragtime attraction on the bill, we were something new and different, so we drew lots of spectators eager for a break from the trad jazz combos playing tunes that everybody had heard 1,000 times. We were invited back in 1985 and 1987. Although we performed a lot during 1985, it was a year of things falling apart. Between January and April, there was a power struggle at KALW that started with the firing of its development director, Bill Moriyama, and ended with a new administration. During Moriyama's tenure, the station's listenership had tripled, owing mostly to the vintage music programs that Moriyama and David Fowler had promoted, including ours. By the way, Don Neely's, who's on the bill here this week, had one of those vintage music programs. The newcomers at KALW were more interested in struggling against United States subversion of Central American governments than in maintaining the music lineup. Nevertheless, we continued recording at the studio through September and broadcasting the results. The death blow to our efforts, as well as Peter Minton's, came on October 1st, when the beautiful Emerson cabinet grand piano at the station was reclaimed by its lender, the Piedmont Piano Company, that furnished the pianos for this festival. In July 1986, Come On In Here followed Moriyama to KCSM, the public radio station of the College of San Mateo. KCSM didn't have a studio with a piano, so from then on, all our new material came from live location tapes, mostly recorded by Paul Johnson and Rob Thomas. Is Rob here? Rob's not here. Anyway, he's around the festival. The worst bit of luck for us was that the Valencia Rose closed in November 1985, just a few weeks after our last performance there, leaving us once again without a monthly venue. Larry struggled valiantly to find a club in San Francisco that would give us a steady slot. None of the places we tried worked out. Fortunately, while we were shopping around the city for a gig, I sent an audition tape to Berkeley's Ashkenaz Music and Dance Club, and we were promptly offered a January date there. By May of 1986, it had become our new base, where we played regularly through March 1990. It was our longest gig anywhere. Ashkenaz was a warehouse that its owner, David Nadell, had converted to look like an Eastern European synagogue, something like one, with mirrors, in the 1970s. A big dance floor occupied most of the space, with chairs and tables set up to suit the entertainment. Mirrors lined one wall so that dancers could watch themselves having fun. The very high stage, which you see here, made of unpainted wood, was at the far end of the room, backed by a frequently changing display that ranged from a giant collage to just a bunch of random posters, as you see in this picture. We feared that the move to Berkeley would cut us off from our old San Francisco fans, and to some extent, that was true. Oh, you notice the silhouettes of the dancers in this poster. But the big dance floor turned out to add a new dimension to the entertainment when I started offering lessons in period dances like the Grizzly Bear, that's Sean Sharp in the picture. The Grizzly Bear, the Turkey Trot, the one-step, and the two-step. Stan Isaacs also taught the old steps for us on at least one occasion. Are you here, Stan? Oh, yeah. Did you teach just that one time?
I don't remember.
I don't either.
We didn't even listen to a lot.
Dancers were encouraged to come to our ragtime balls in period attire, and they often did. We occasionally put on cakewalk competitions, judged by Richard Rutlinger, with a luscious cake, not this one, from a fancy Berkeley bakery awarded to the winning couple. Sean Sharp tells me that he won at least one of those cakewalk contests. We had a couple of gigs in Los Angeles in 1986. In August, we were invited to play 6 sets over 2 days at the Los Angeles Classic Jazz Festival. We were well received, and that probably led to us being asked to play a ragtime ball at the Variety Arts Center in downtown LA in November, with former rock star Ian Whitcomb also on the bill. 1986 was a tough year overall, though. We played at least 27 engagements in at least 16 different venues that year. That doesn't sound like very many until you consider the facts that in most of those places we got very little money, and that all of us had full-time jobs outside the ensemble. Rehearsing, traveling to and from gigs, and finally performing consumed a lot of additional time. Add to this the circumstance that some of the musicians made part of their living playing from music, so that they often had to choose between making a few bucks with the Chrysanthemums and earning considerably more accompanying a singer or playing a symphonic or chamber gig. As a result, the band was stretched thin, and we played a lot of gigs with substitutes who hadn't rehearsed with the ensemble. That's one of them there. Some of the subs were first-class players, who like to have a little fun with us, even at the low pay we offered. But it's always better for a group to have worked through the repertoire together in advance. On top of that, even continuing members would now and then miss our regular rehearsals in order to perform somewhere else for pay. The sometimes very high quality of our performance was lower overall than it could have been, and occasionally mediocre. The situation started to irritate Larry DeLaurier, who was a very irritable person, which made him progressively harder to work with. But that was not the only thing that irritated him. From the very beginning of the band's life, he had been annoyed by the brass player's failure to balance with the woodwinds and strings. Although we had worked on the problem, he had never quite felt it was solved. It wasn't, especially in the case of the trombone. He also resented the position I had come to have in the band. Because I was the MC at gigs and the announcer on our radio show, people would often assume that I was the leader of the band. Years before, however, we had agreed that the band would have 3 leaders with divided responsibilities: Larry, Philip, and me. Toward the end of 1986, Larry came to focus most of his irritation on clarinetist Bill Tull, who had been a member for 4 years. To discuss and perhaps mediate their frequent disputes at rehearsals and performances, a small meeting was convened in December. We all tried to soothe Larry's feelings, to persuade him to reach an accommodation with Bill and to stay with the band. We reminded him of how difficult it would be to find a clarinetist as good as Bill, who would be willing to play as much as we did for the peanuts that we earned. But by the end of the meeting, Larry was only angrier than he had been at the beginning. He wanted Bill out, and Bill was still in. A few days later, Larry resigned from performing with the ensemble, but continued as our librarian, and a couple of months after the resignation, he wrote that he would stop managing the library in July 1987. Larry's energy and perseverance had powered the ensemble from his inception, not to mention his costume sense. Besides being one of the founders, he recruited musicians and hustled gigs, built and managed our collection of more than 700 orchestrations, and read avidly about the era to get new ideas. He managed the mailing list and commissioned the show cards. The mums were at the center of his life, and he may have done more to move us toward success than any other single member of the group, although the others did a lot. It's no wonder that he felt that he wasn't getting enough credit, that it was his band, and that he should be able to banish musicians he couldn't get along with. Bill stayed on with the mums until the very end. We managed to replace Larry for a few months with an outstanding conservatory student named Sharon Brooks Keith, who plays on some tracks of our 4th LP, but she wasn't available for enough gigs to be a regular member. We were lucky to find Robert Gray to replace her for the band's last few years. During 1987, we continued performing at Ashkenaz and picked up a few other gigs. The Sacramento Jubilee took us out of town again over Memorial Day weekend, and we also appeared at a small jazz festival in Petaluma, a fairly big one in San Diego, and the prestigious Sedalia, Missouri festival. The invitation to the Scott Joplin Ragtime Festival resulted from Larry's long correspondence with Richard Zimmerman, who was the festival's producer. Sedalia was the farthest we ever got from the Bay Area, and 1987 was the first time that the festival had included a dance, and we provided the music for it. After this point, festival invitations were few, mostly I think because we were just too expensive. Most festivals paid groups on a per musician basis, in addition to covering expenses for travel, lodging, and sometimes meals. Most bands at jazz festivals had 7 or fewer musicians, so we had to be perceived as at least 43% more valuable than the average jazz band to make hiring us worth it. Ragtime festivals, where most of the performers are singles, would have to place an even higher premium on us to justify the investment. Too bad for us. 1987 was also the year in which we finished an LP of pieces about San Francisco and California, Dancing on the Edge of the World, recorded at Mike Cogan's splendid new Bay Records facility in Berkeley. It was pretty successful, and Bob Erdos urged us to follow it up quickly with another one, Joy Rag, in 1988. The proximity of the new studio to my house in Oakland made it much easier for me to collaborate with Mike on important aspects of editing like balance, placement, and where exactly the splices should go. The two LPs had a much better sound than any of our earlier efforts, but alas, they were to be our last. Although we maintained our monthly gigs at Ashkenaz through all of 1988 and landed a couple of club gigs in San Francisco and a dance for the NOJC, we had very few other performances and not a single festival invitation. As it became harder than ever to field the team that came to rehearsals, we had to rely more often on subs, good subs, like Mike Hart, but subs. The biggest downer of 1988 was that our relationship with KCSM began to fall apart. It became difficult for me to get an engineer to record my commentary and splice it with the location recordings that we had been depending on. Although the music was still good, and I put a lot of effort into writing the spoken part of the show, the overall result was subpar, and I came to think that the station was no longer terrifically interested in the show. So I gave it up. It's a long drive from Oakland to San Mateo on congested freeways at night. KPFA, a Berkeley station, broadcast us live in October, but it was just one shot that led nowhere. Chrysanthemum's slow tapering off had begun. In November 1989, we played at the third annual West Coast Ragtime Festival, which was then in Fresno. We had declined an invitation. This is to show how far it was to get to Fresno. We had declined an invitation to play the very first WCRF in 1987 because they could offer us only $800. But this year they offered us $1,500 plus one night in a motel, but no meals. So we took it, hoping that the LP sales would add enough to make the 360-mile round-trip drive worth the time and trouble. Once again, we had to work with subs, this time on violin and piano. But we played well, and the small festival crowd liked us a lot, leading the board to invite us back in 1991. Ashkenaz concert dances continued through the most of the rest of 1989, with big crowds still having fun with the music and the dance lessons, until a major earthquake on October 17th closed the Bay Bridge for a month. We had a gig scheduled for November 12th. This is not the Ashkenaz, by the way. We had a gig scheduled for November 12th, but I don't remember whether we played it or not. Since the bridge was still closed at this point, the musicians from San Francisco, which was most of the band, would have had to get to and from Berkeley by a long, slow drive across the Golden Gate and Richmond bridges. The band suspended its monthly gigs in December through February, then tried to pull things together with an Equinox Ragtime Ball at Ashkenaz in March 1990, which turned out to be our last engagement there. I think, yes, Stan Isaac's name is near the bottom in the center of this, so that proves that you get dance lessons, at least that. I don't know if Karen was there or not. I suppose so. Yeah.
Credit for you, Karen.
And just after that, Will Bamer moved to New York for work, leaving us without his long-honed management skills. Gigs during the rest of 1990 were few and far between, but toward the end of the year, we scored a new continuing engagement back in San Francisco. Ron Lanza, one of the owners of the late Valencia Rose, had started a new club called Josie's Cabaret on the edge of the Castro district at 16th and Market. He offered us a monthly gig starting in October, shortly after Josie's opened. The room was smaller than the Rose, long and narrow, with a high and very small stage at the far end. The stage worked well for stand-up comedy, but we almost overflowed it. We thought that a venue near Castro Street would be even better for us than the Utah, which was in the south of Market, the Valencia Rose, which was in the Mission, or the Ashkenaz, which was way off in Berkeley. We were wrong. It had been such a long time since we had had a regular Frisco gig that only a small portion of our Valencia Rose followers showed up. Sometimes we filled the house, and sometimes we only had a dozen or so patrons. It was disappointing. Part of the problem may have been that Josie's had the reputation of being a comedy club rather than a space for music, and there was no dance floor. And who can find a place to park in the Castro? In Prospect, 1991 looked as if it might be a better year. We had our monthly concerts at Josie's lined up, along with a February session at the monthly meeting of the Trad Jazz Club in Santa Rosa, a ragtime ball in Sacramento in May, a return to the Fresno West Coast Ragtime Festival in November, and a nibble from a festival in Salina, Kansas. But in fact, it was the worst year of all, the year that we disbanded. The Santa Rosa and Sacramento engagements were okay, but the Josie's gigs limped along with mostly small audiences, and the Salina gig didn't happen at all. The sky had begun to turn gray early in the year when Larry Delorier, only 46 years old, died from complications of AIDS. His former bandmates, including Will, who flew in from New York, gathered for a memorial at the Mansion Hotel on February 17th, then played at Josie's later in the afternoon. In the second half of the year, I spent a sabbatical semester in Barcelona with my boyfriend, later my husband, Juan Miguel. Pianist Scott Fogelson took the reins of the band, I used Echoes of Seville because I didn't have a photo of the dance card for Barcelona, the second biggest hit in Europe. Where was I? Pianist Scott Fogelson took the reins of the band, replaced me with a conservatory student, and convened rehearsals twice a month in order to work up new material, as many as 5 new pieces per month, and to tighten up the ensemble sound. But in spite of Scott's efforts, there was never a full turnout at either rehearsals or performances, and the audiences at Josie's continued to shrink. Meanwhile, in Barcelona, no longer subject to the headaches and disappointments of managing an orchestra, I pondered my future as I swam laps at the gym. Did I really want to go back to playing at Josie's, soliciting gigs, scrambling for subs, and worrying about not maintaining performance standards? Or should I just set aside 13 years of sometimes intense effort in order to get some peace of mind? In October, I wrote a letter of resignation and sent it to my fellow monks back in the States. What time is it? Oh. By November, the 10 musicians were playing at Josie's for an estimated 10 to 15 loyal fans. The invitation to the West Coast Ragtime Festival in Fresno seemed increasingly less attractive. A 360-mile trip, this time for $850 plus lodging, and no allowance for food, drink, or travel. At the last rehearsal before the November Josie's gig, Scott told the 7 colleagues who showed up that he had canceled Fresno and was quitting the band. Almost everyone felt that the end had been near for a while, and they sadly accepted the fact that now it had arrived. Philip wrote to me about the breakup, adding that Suzanne, quote, had a good suggestion that we give a final farewell concert with me in it. It would give a sense of completion to me, that is Philip, to the band and to the audience. A last hurrah, ending on an upbeat. Would you consider it? I hope so. It was a very good suggestion, but when I returned to Berkeley, I had a lot on my plate. After such a long absence, I had to hustle to teach my spring semester courses, and I had rehearsals and performances with another band that I had joined. Finally, toward the end of the year, I found a date that everyone could commit to, organized a few rehearsals, and rented a hall at Live Oak Park in Berkeley for our first annual farewell concert. Will Bamer, I got that from Pogo, Will Bamer had moved back to the Bay Area by that time, giving us a full complement of regulars. Suzanne Long, Debbie Purcellin, Mariah Ellis, Philip Grudy, Robert Gray, Bill Tall, Patricia Crossan, Bob Phillips, Scott Fogelsong, Will, and myself. To bring in a few more customers, I persuaded Wally Rose to play piano during the intermission. The room was as big as a basketball court and had no stage, so we set up inside a rope line in the middle of the space, reserving the area in front of us for seated listeners and the area behind for dancing. Will decorated the high, drab concrete walls with more than 100 of our best-looking and most colorful show cards, and we programmed favorites chosen by the musicians, opening with Joplin's Chrysanthemum. The big and boisterous crowd, there was no alcohol, but there was plenty of weed in the surrounding park, included a lot of my Berkeley colleagues and students, and we quickly ran out of chairs. In spite of the beat-up and out-of-tune house spinet, the band sounded good, and so did Wally. Our final encore was Horo Nelly, a rag that accelerates rapidly like a runaway horse, before ending with everyone shouting the title. The audience responded with a roaring ovation, and we invited them to share a cake Suzanne had brought, decorated with the legend, "Till we meet again," from Susan, which was her name in those days. I was happy that we ended our career with something like the same good feelings and high spirits that we had experienced at the Castro 14 years before. So how am I doing? Oh, I can do the last page. Good. Unlike the 1970s, the 1980s were terrible for gay people. AIDS hit San Francisco in 1981 like a bomb. Once when we were talking about it at a rehearsal, Patricia Crossan said, "You guys must be scared to death." We were. Reliable diagnosis didn't come along until 1985, and there was no treatment until 1987. President Reagan, who had showed some courage and compassion in denouncing Proposition 6 back in 1978, didn't even acknowledge the epidemic until 1985, after he had been elected to a second term. It was widely believed then that the time between infection and diagnosis could be as long as 10 years, so that your pre-1981 sexual activity could kill you now, or next year, or the year after. It was a decade of death and the fear of death. Excuse me. I knew I would lose my composure. At least 8 of the musicians who at one time or another played with Chrysanthemum died of the disease. And probably there were more among many musicians I didn't keep in touch with. Everyone had friends who were sick or dying or dead. Gay people needed relief from the anxiety and anguish. Our music, sometimes frivolous, always exotic, and so different from the boom boom of disco, provided a little lift of the spirits, a little glimpse of a different world, a little escape from the present, just a little, and just for a little while, but sometimes that was enough. That's it. Thank you. I want to thank Rob Thomas for all the things he's done for the band. I thought he'd be here. I want to thank Mike Hart for suggesting this as a seminar, and Virginia for accepting it, and Mike Chisholm for doing all the helping make this setup, and Jeff Green also. So, is it time that we need to leave the room, or do I have 5 minutes for questions?
We can definitely take a couple questions if you would like.
Okay, couple questions.
First hand up.
Yes.
Bruce, I want to know if you ever played a muffler.
Played a muffler? No, it's too difficult. It takes years to learn the muffler.
Any more questions?
No.
It's
Yeah.
more of a comment. I
just want to say thank you for sharing your story. And I'm a nurse, and so I was going to ask you about the whole like late 1980s and the crisis that the AIDS pandemic. And I just wanted to say I appreciate you sharing about your friends, and thank you for keeping them alive by talking about them. That's amazing.
Dr. Harris' question?
So, would you say that the trajectory of your band was similar to the trajectory of other bands, and similar to the current experience of bands that we listen to today?
No, because the PCRO will never die. Go ahead.
We have time for one more. Go ahead.
Oh. Who?
I heard you once only, and that was at an outdoor concert in Cupertino, I believe sometime in the early 80s, 81 or 82. It was in a shopping center in Cupertino.
I remember you.
Oh, you do? Anyway, the question is, I know you made some recordings. Are any of those still available anywhere?
No, they're available on eBay.
On eBay?
Yeah. That's where I got some of the images for this.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Well, alrighty. Thank you so much, Bruce. Ladies and gentlemen, please stick around. Frederick Conley's up next.